Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Good day, good morning. It's a great pleasure that for the first event of the second day of the Grounded Festival, we have with us Abir Kopty, a Palestinian journalist and writer based in Berlin. She has written widely, published in the Middle East Eye, The Nation, Mondoweiss, among other publications, and she has also worked in the field of human rights or dedicated herself to that topic. I will not take too much of our and her time. Abir, welcome. It's great to have you with us, and I think you will somehow continue talking about the fact that words kill too. And the role international media has played in Israel's genocide in Gaza. So thank you, and I'll be quiet now.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for having me. I prepared a lecture. I hope I will not exceed the time so we can allow some time for questions. It's been 10 months into Israel's genocide in Gaza. I cannot start this talk without commemorating the tens of thousands of souls we have lost, if not more, acknowledging the plight of those who are still alive but have lost everything, and without commemorating 140 colleagues, journalists, cameramen, and reporters killed in Gaza. 10 months into this, and Western media is still debating if this is a genocide or not, still justifying Israeli slaughter, daily massacres, and displacement, still obliterating Israel's responsibility despite the mounting evidence and the documentation of its crimes. But I want to take you back to the beginning of this genocide. Let's recall the first few days. It was not clear what exactly happened. Israel used this time to press hard on some disinformation and fake stories. They were repeated constantly by the media, by journalists who did not do the due verifications, since they were really busy in demonizing Palestinians and believing anything Israel would tell them Palestinians did. That was the first few days. And since the media repeated those claims and lies, so did the politicians. They just repeated whatever Israel fed them. So there were stories about rapes, mass rapes, 40 beheaded babies, babies burned, babies put in oven, babies they hanged on laundry racks, so many stories. And the Israeli propaganda, which we call Hasbara, it's called Hasbara, threw out there as much such stories as possible, knowing that the media will pick them up. It was also a tactic used by the Israeli propaganda to overwhelm you, the audience, the people, with negative reporting about the Palestinians and keep us, the Palestinians, busy debunking them. Those tactics were exposed. We talked about them so many times before October 7th, and we also talked about them after October 7th, and we exposed them right from day one, but no one wanted to listen. It is really amazing how we learn about those propaganda warfares and theories, but when we see them unfold in reality, we ignore them. I mentioned some of the lies. By now, we know they were lies. They were exposed as lies. Several media outlets already made thorough work to debunk them. Even in some Israeli media outlets, they were exposed as lies. But that was too late, right? Because those lies have cost us tens of thousands dead bodies, thousands under the rubble, 2 million people facing a brutal mass slaughter, and has no limits in its barbarity, and a disseminated Gaza with no future for those surviving the genocide. Journalists, especially in Western media, who parroted those lies, bear responsibility for creating the fertile ground for Israel to commit this genocide and justify it. And this is what we mean when we say words kill too. And by the way, even that those lies were debunked, there's still today many outlets, politicians, Israeli propagandists that are still repeating them in the media, and they remain unchallenged. But that is not all. I want to take you also 10 days into the genocide. The BBC published an article under the title, and I quote, Does Hamas build tunnels under hospitals and schools? This is not journalism. This is adopting Israeli talking points. That has been repeated widely by many Western media. It sets the context to justify any crime by Israel. Did we read anywhere in this article that BBC could not independently verify? No, we didn't. We only read this line: BBC or other media outlet could not independently verify when we are discussing Palestinian atrocities that Israel is responsible for. We have read this line, could not independently verify, many times. And that leaves the reader with doubts as for any story coming out of Gaza. In that case too, words kill. Since that article in the BBC, Israel has destroyed in full or in part 85% of Gaza schools. That is 480 schools. All 12 of Gaza's universities and colleges have been destroyed. 84% of health facilities are damaged or destroyed. Only a third of 36 hospitals in Gaza are still functioning in very minimum capacity because there is no medical supplies let in and because some part of it was damaged. And after every single massacre, every single bombing, Israel justified it with the same talking points that was enforced by this, for example, the example I gave of the BBC article. And it's almost the same talking point, blaming Hamas. Did the media learn anything? No. After every single massacre, Israel's justification was adopted by the media, unquestioned. We've seen a pattern in this genocide. A massacre, a crime, Israel commits a massacre or a crime, Israel justifies it with whatever lie, media repeats, in some cases, and only after a few weeks, a media outlet or a respected organization debunks, and they only do that in an attempt to show some integrity and maintain a facade of fairness. And then when it's debunked, no one covers that as extensively as they did with the lie. The first lie holds, of course, and the damage was done. The narrative is there. It is often too late. Israel is encouraged to continue. And with that, Israel is encouraged to continue and had indeed moved forward to a new massacre and a new massacre and a new lie and back and forth. That has been the massacre in this genocide. So when we watch the media coverage or read a news story or report, it is important to look deeper. It is not just what they choose or not choose to report. It is how they report it. The titles, the language, the terms they use, the framing, who to quote, what to focus on, how much space you allow Palestinians versus Israeli voices, what images they use, what facts they choose to display and what facts they choose to omit. Palestinians are almost find their death, not killed. Israel is almost always absent from titles as the perpetrator, and if mentioned, it's a controversy. I want to mention few examples, and that are really very few examples because there are so many. For example, a CBS, the Canadian broadcaster, headline for the tragic story of Palestinian child Hind Rajab. If you recall her story, she was 6 years old. She was killed in the car. First, she was calling for help from the car with 6 other bodies that were shot and killed by Israeli army. She was there for days, and then she was also killed. Later on, many investigative stories found that the car she was in was hit with 335 bullets, I think the number. So the story, the title CBS chooses for this story, I quote, "Days after she called for help, girl's body found in car in Gaza City," relatives say. Usually our bodies are found dead. We find our death somehow. In a Sky News broadcast report on Israeli forces murdering a Palestinian child, the reporters say, and this is on TV, on Sky TV, And I quote what he said: "A stray bullet found its way into the car and hit a 3-4-year-old young lady." 3-4-year-old is not a child for Sky News because she's Palestinian, she's a young lady. Another article by The Guardian, for example, which was discussing the dehydration, the cut of water. And I quote, "Fears grow as people are dehydrating to death in Gaza, as clean water runs out." No one cut the water for the Palestinians. They just the water simply was cut out. Just another recent title from the New York Times: "The war in Gaza is making thousands orphans." So like the framing also, the war in Gaza, who is launching this war against the Gazans, who is making Palestinian children orphans. And there is also in this like coverage, there is also the uncritical reliance and adoption on Israeli army statement, even though it has been proven time after time that they are not a reliable source. And versus the reporting, for example, and this is another issue that we have faced in this genocide, is the report is when the media adopted also the Israeli talking point when discussing the death toll in Gaza. We almost see with every mention of the number of deaths or killed people in Gaza, they mention that these are the numbers of the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health. And this has one aim: to shed doubt on the number, on the Palestinian story. Now, all this serves in building, of course, the narrative and the context. And it is important here to remember that there are two key functions of the Israeli Hasbara, the Israeli propaganda. A is to present Israel as the victim. You know, the most common talking points that by now we all know like what they are. Israel has the right to self-defense. Israel is under constant threat. Israel is the victim. Israel is the only democracy. The Israeli army is the only the most moral army, etc., etc., and they hold Western values, etc. And B, the other key function is to justify the targeting of civilians by shifting blame for the large number of civilian deaths from Israel to Hamas. So blaming Hamas, this is the second function. So you have heard so many talking points parroted by the media, the Western media, and by the politicians, like using civilians as human shields, tunnels under hospitals. Hamas also kills people. It warns, and Israel warns people before leaving, collateral, but they don't leave. That's why we like blaming the victim, etc., etc. And I really, really call you to read every article through this lens. Look for those hidden talking points in every article that sets a narrative that is completely biased to Israel. So to conclude, the role of media in this genocide is clear. It is to obliterate Israel's responsibility and shield Israel from accountability. There are so many examples that we can't cover in one lecture, and those examples are not isolated incidents of a failure or mistake or malpractice. They are all part of a system of bias against Palestinians and Arabs in general, and I would say also immigrants and people of color, because it is all connected. Now, on the one hand, we know by now that there is internal censorship happening. Yes, there is. There is a pressure on the journalists and editors, and they fear. But does that by itself explain the cowardness in having integrity, journalism integrity, and covering the story in fairness and show empathy to victims of a genocide? Does that explain the complicity? Because no, I don't think it does explain how, it does explain by itself, like that journalists fear, it doesn't explain that journalists and editors are going out of their way sometimes, doing intellectual gymnastics, finding the right words, the right terminology, the right language to shield Israel, with one aim, to shield Israel. And we know that media could do better, because now we have a reference. We have a recent, fresh, new reference, the coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And I'm sure many of you seen, so many people are doing this comparison, showing titles from here and titles from there. So we have a reference. We know that media can do better, but they're not. So here is the bottom line. It is not just internal pressure on journalists. It is not just malpractice. It is not just mistakes. It is not just that journalists fear losing their jobs. It is, for me, in my opinion, it is first and foremost that these journalists are inherently biased. And this bias is rooted in Islamophobic and racist attitudes. So yes, I am saying here that so many journalists hold racist attitudes. And this is one of the major reasons behind the way we are, the coverage we are seeing. And they are making conscious efforts to dehumanize Palestinians and justify their murder and shield Israel from accountability. And for me, I think that is the bottom line. This is how this genocide was allowed for 10 months, airing live on our screens, and we could do nothing to stop it. And a debate regarding the role of journalism in this genocide will accompany us years, if not decades to come. I don't think there is a way back from this point. And I think there is a need for really very deep and serious discussion around the role of journalism. At the same time, we should not feel disempowered. This is not the time, and we cannot allow ourselves to get tired and stop. We should continue to call out journalists and use organization tirelessly, because it's not just about Gaza, it's the world order we seek to challenge and fix. I think the myth of Western, professional, decent journalism has fallen apart, like so many other myths in this genocide. For example, the myth of international law and world order, justice system, and so on. And there is so much we can do. Aside from continuing the debate on this, it is important also to, first of all, read articles and watch news with scrutiny. Do not trust. We have to be critical. We have to read between the lines. We have to check what are the aim of this article, what are they doing there. I really, it's very important. And to call out journalists and media sources. There are so many people doing it, and it's important to amplify these voices and join these voices. And calling out, we should not give up on that. We should not stop doing that. We should not get bored of that. We should not get tired of that. Calling out journalists is very important. Also amplifying Palestinian journalists. I've mentioned in the beginning of my talk that there are 140 journalists who lost their lives. They lost their lives to get us the stories, to get us the facts, to get us to report for us the genocide. As you know, there are no foreign journalists allowed in Gaza. Israel prevented any journalist to enter Gaza and cover the stories. And if they were allowed only embedded with the Israeli army. So of course, we know what kind of story will come out of this. So it is very important to support Palestinian journalists. Those who are still alive, survived for now, are under constant threat. Many of them are reporting about threats coming from Israel against them, or there were attempts to kill them. So it is important to amplify these voices, call for the protection of these journalists. It is important to not stop bearing witness. I think bearing witness is a very important thing. Publish stories, talk about stories, talk everywhere about what's happening. This is very important because our role as people outside Gaza is to act and work to stop this genocide and to bear witness. So Israel cannot bury the truth, because this is what they will try to do, and this is what they are trying to do with the help of the media. And we should we should work tirelessly to bear witness and make sure the truth is not buried. As I said, like, expose those biases, protest them, protest to your local media, to international media about those biases. And I think at the end, it is important to remember that we have responsibility to hold these journalists accountable, because that's when we look back into history, that is what we're going to look at. Did we say no? Did we protest? Did we amplify Palestinian voices? Did we hold these journalists accountable? And with that, I would like to end and maybe allow some questions from the audience. I thank you so much for having the time to listen.
Thank you, Abir.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. And yes, questions are welcomed. If anyone feels more comfortable asking them in Slovene, we can also translate. There's a microphone there, another here. Raise your hand, we will get it to you. If there is no first questions right away, because probably I think we're all still processing what you have said, maybe I would be just interested to hear also a little bit about your experience. You mentioned self-censorship, you mentioned pressures. What's your experience? You know, how does this propaganda work on the ground? Does it mean that if a media publishes an article that is unbiased or that amplifies Palestinian voices, do they hear right away from either Israeli organizations or some kind of concerned citizens whose identity is perhaps unknown, but still they write and talk? So concretely, have you got any experiences on how this contra effect of trying to silence critical voices works, so to somehow prepare, you know, to challenge that as well? And we don't hear you, so maybe it's muted. It's okay.
Yes, personally, and I know many colleagues who have been targeted as, like, you know, the magic word is anti-Semitism. Of course, you know by now that if you dare to say anything, you're immediately depicted as anti-Semitism. We are so used to that being like called anti-Semitism for whatever we say, just the fact that we stand by the people of Gaza and name it as genocide, it's by itself a ground for accusation. Of course, I don't really pay attention to this, but some people are like they surrender to the pressure. As I said, as I said in my lecture, I don't think that that's the only reason. Of course, people fear to be depicted as anti-Semitic and they lose their jobs, but Israeli Hasbara propaganda has a lot of arms. It is not just an idea. We have to understand it's an institution. There is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There are some other institutions that work tirelessly on this. They monitor the media. They protest anything that they don't like. They put pressure. They threaten. They call people anti-Semitism. They don't mind using any means to stop any coverage from being fair to the Palestinians. And they threaten journalists. Of course, many journalists have came out and talked about it clearly. There were also reports in different outlets about censorship within the news outlet. Like, for example, there was a report about the New York Times. They have an internal system of censorship. So their journalists do face a system of censorship internally. There are certain terminology they're not allowed to use, or they are allowed to use only when it comes to Israeli, like Israelis being killed, but not when Palestinians being killed. I mean, like, there is a very clear editorial lines, and there is a wide perceptions that has been established in the media, and the journalists know their limits. They know their limits. They know what they can say, what they cannot say. And some journalists, there are also different types of the journalists. Some journalists, they know the limits. Some journalists, they create the limits. And some journalists, they go out of their ways because they really want to justify Israel's crimes. they align themselves with Israel. Israel has aligned itself with the West, and the Western journalists, many of them, have aligned themselves with Israel. So they go out of their way. They think, they internally, they debate what kind of title will shield Israel's responsibility. And there are some journalists who probably have the will to do something different, but they can't, either because they fear or because they are influenced also by the whole the guidelines in the editorial. And many of them, they don't want to do their job. Like, I mean, they take things as ready from the Israeli propaganda, and they don't do any more effort to do anything because they fear to do efforts and because they don't want to do efforts. Like, I don't know how many, like, we've seen many independent media outlets out there that has done differently. So it's also about independency. So we've seen some outlets in the US, for example, that are independent, and we've seen completely different coverage of the genocide. So it is also a question of control, of who controls, of who, of like where the media stands.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Yes. The most
I just wanted to ask, for us common folk, let's say, what would be the most effective way to call out the media outlets? Like what, through comments, media, petitions, emails, or something like that? Please explain to me, how do you guys do it, your organization, stuff like that? Thank you so much.
Yeah. So there are so many means, and depends on the media outlet, and you have to look what is more effective. Sometimes it is effective to go in front of the media and do a protest, for example. Fox in the US, they did it in front of the New York Times, exposing the New York Times biases. Some others did a unsubscribe campaign. If this media is reliant on people's funding, then you can do unsubscribe campaign, and it's painful for them. You can also do letters to the media. If you do and it has to be organized campaign, because if one or two send this letter, it won't make a difference. But if there is a campaign of tens or hundreds of people protesting a certain coverage, then they might listen. You can also, if you feel like there is a room to meet those journalists and talk to them and see this is being racist attitudes, or is it just laziness, or is it just fear? It's good also, if you have access to those journalists, to have one-on-one calls, or go a group and meet with them. I think it depends on the media outlet, how much access you have to it. If you don't have so much access, maybe emails campaign, maybe calling it out on social media sometimes is effective as well. There has been a lot of those type of actions that we did, calling out journalists on social media. Especially, I remember in the first few days and weeks when all these lies were being spread, we were calling out journalists one by one on social media, and that did some effect. I'm not saying it did a huge change, because the genocide has been happening for 10 months. But as I said, we should not give up to them, and we should not get tired. We should continue to do that, because this is our responsibility. So I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. Some more questions. We have another one in the back.
I want to say first, thank you very much for this very informative talk. I would like to ask you if you could share some of the more credible and independent media outlets on Palestine. Thank you.
Okay, so so I would start from the big organizations to the more independent organizations. Of course, Al Jazeera English, AG Plus on social media has been doing great coverage on Palestine. really wide and informative and bearing witness, and amplifying Palestinian journalists and stories, and covering a lot of the stories. And there are many Palestinian organizations that it's worth following, for example, for investigative work, such as Al-Haq, who is doing a lot of forensic work to expose Israeli lies about justifications of massacres, etc. I think Forensic Architecture is another organization. And media outlets, for example, you have Electronic Intifada, Mondowise, Intercept. Intercept did really a lot of work on exposing Israeli lies, Democracy Now! Whom am I forgetting? Yeah, I think those basically can really give you a lot of information. The Cradle as well can give you a lot of information about what's happening.
Okay.
I hope I did not forget anyone, so no one is angry at me.
Okay, Middle East Eye perhaps as well?
Middle East Eye, yes. Middle East Eye as well. Middle East Monitor, yes.
We have another question.
And what about media in Israel itself?
That's another lecture, because I'm a researcher and I look into the Israeli media, and I have to say, like, this is another lecture, but Israeli media, Israeli journalists have been the cheerleaders of the genocide. If you see exceptions in English in the international media, these are the exceptions, and these are made to make it look good that there is a critical Israeli media. And it helps them with the ICJ case. They want to show that they have critical voices, that they are debating, that they are democracy, and they have debates over the crimes they are committing. But when you see articles that are discussing crimes, it is the exception, it is not the norm. And it is important to even read those articles in a critical eye. Most Israeli media, I would say 99% of Israeli media, is a cheerleader for the genocide. Justifications, Palestinians hardly exist in those news outlets. Massacres that the whole world is horrified by are not shown in Israeli media, let alone that there are many documentations of journalists in studios, in the news studios, talking about the killing of more Palestinians. Like one journalist said, we did a mistake that we didn't kill 100,000 in the first few weeks. This was on Israeli mainstream media, and this is the type of messages that we have been hearing by many journalists. When journalists are discussing the army's operation in Gaza, the army, it is always that they want more, and that's like, it is really a cheerleading for a genocide, justifying genocide, denial as well. Like there is a denial of what Israel is committing. There is a denial of what their soldiers are filming and showing us online. Like, we've seen hundreds of videos of soldiers documenting their own crimes in Gaza, and these are ignored completely by the Israeli media and the Israeli society.
Abir,
Yeah.
thank you for your breath and your time. It's always very refreshing to hear you speak. I do agree with everything you just said, and I would actually go beyond in the analysis to say that it's not just the bias of reporters. I mean, these are corporations, these big news outlets, and it's really about the interests that align with other corporations and so on. And I do, for the question that was posed about the tactics, there is so much to be done. You mentioned many of these examples. But I wanted to really ask you a question. It comes off as very basic, but I think it's very important to understand, or to at least discuss. When we talk about either reporting or looking for narrative, 10 months into this horrific genocide that everyone can see unfold, does it really matter to speak to the New York Times or to the Washington Post, or to try to name and shame them, or to try to put them on the spot, or to try to negate what they're saying? Does it really matter? Isn't it clear? Or perhaps it does, it sounds basic, but isn't it clear? It seems that you're either human or sorry, but you're not, you know, like you either follow with human values or you don't. It seems there's no more gray space anymore. So does any effort we put into, you know, calling out these media outlets or trying to change them, is that really relevant anymore? Or and to follow up on that, like what is it you think that Palestinian journalists from Gaza, from 48, from West Bank, what do they need from the global community? What is it that they actually need beyond just sharing and writing about? And just as a side comment, I think actually Israeli media like Haaretz does a better job of reporting than the New York Times. You know, like when it came to the gang rape or when it comes to all the stories, the Haaretz actually writes about it, and then no one in the world does. So that's actually quite interesting. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so the questions you raise is actually, I think many of the audience will agree, it's questions that are on our mind all the time. I mean, what's the point? That's probably the most common question I've heard in exchanges with my friends, colleagues, comrades, fellow journalists, etc. What's the point? And I think I mentioned a little bit of this. The point is bearing witness, and the point is not giving up. So yes, I know there is no point. There is almost no point. And we are like working against really very powerful system that is really oppressing any ability to change. But if we remain silent, then these voices will prevail. And for the history, maybe we cannot stop the genocide. And I'm sorry to say that, and I don't want you to lose hope. I think we need to continue working tirelessly. We should not allow ourselves to give up. But even if we don't change the coverage of the New York Times today, we have to call it out, because in the history, people will look back and they have to see that people called out the New York Times, that we raised our voices, that people said no. And I think for the longer term, there is no way back from this moment. There will be a lot of debate and discussion around the role of media and journalism in this genocide. And it is important to take part in this debate. And taking part in this debate has to be live, has to be an ongoing protest from day one until today, 10 months, 11 months. We have to continue doing that for the sake of not letting these voices prevail, for the sake of telling them they are not the majority, they do not represent us, and there are millions and millions of people who disagree with them. I think this is the main important thing about that. Now, to your question about Palestinian journalists. So in each country, there are foreign journalists who can do some more pressure on their governments and on the Israeli government to protect these journalists. Because these journalists, we are losing them one by one, and we will lose more. Like, we know that we will lose more. Many of them are under threat, and there is not many of them remain. So one of the things that can be done is that journalists, foreign journalists in each country, should also take responsibility and help to protect these journalists through pressure on their governments and through their governments on Israeli government. So this one thing can also help, aside of amplifying their voices, sharing their stories, etc., etc. It's important also to lobby in each one in their own country, because that foreign journalists are not allowed in Gaza. This is by itself is a shameful thing for the journalism, for foreign journalism, that they didn't do enough pressure to get into Gaza, that they were so helpless in front of Israeli dictation. That's really a shameful episode in their history. And that they are not, until today, not doing enough to do. There have been some attempts by foreign journalists, like a petition, a letter. They tried to go to the Israeli court, etc. It was not enough. That foreign journalists across the globe are not doing enough pressure to bear witness and go cover the genocide on the ground is really a shameful episode in history. And maybe this is where also we need to work with journalists in each country.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so just to confirm to the first one, it's about naming and shaming, it's about calling them out, and it's not about asking them to change the narrative, because that won't happen.
That won't happen. I don't think it will happen. Maybe it will happen slightly because they want to show a facade of integrity, but naming and shaming is very important.
Thank you.
Perhaps one or two more short questions. Abir, do you have perhaps anything to say about the situation in Germany, given that you're in Berlin? And do you feel that self-censorship has played a strong role, or is the situation really so terrible?
It is so terrible. Not to beautify the situation, but I mean, I haven't discussed a lot the German media because I wanted to talk generally, but what I said about most foreign media coverage, it's like triple worse in the German media, especially that German journalists think that no one reads German, so no one will hold them accountable. But I think it's also a very shameful episode in Germany's history, the way they've been covering this genocide. They've been the mouthpiece of the Israeli army and the Israeli government. I remember one article in probably the early days, maybe the early weeks or months of the genocide. A journalist, an editor, wrote an article, "Long live the Israeli army," like the army that is committing the worst, the most barbaric crimes we've ever seen in modern history. Long live the Israeli army, or the IDF, I think the title. There are so many of the lies that I mentioned in the beginning, and we all know by now that they are lies, are still depicted in German media, and no one is questioning them or challenging them, let alone the brutal incitement against protesters that we're seeing the results of it every day, the brutality of the police against the Palestinian protesters or the pro-Palestinian protesters. This was a direct result of the incitement in the media, continuous incitement, calling out, like showing pictures of names of activists and calling them anti-Semitic. It's wild in German media, and it's really shameful episode in German media, and we will discuss it in the future, of course, a lot, because yeah, like it's really, we don't understand how a country that have this history of genocide can really like repeat the history right in front of everyone, like so proudly, without really noticing that it's really it's very wrong and very shameful and very bad.
One last chance for a question, comment. Okay, then perhaps I will say thank you so much for taking time and being with us. I think also we have some work to do, reading to do, and then writing and complaining, I guess, loudly and yeah, forcefully to try to get the Palestinian stories and voices heard and stories told. Thank you for all your work. And I do hope that soon perhaps we meet also in person in Ljubljana. And yes, all the best.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope so too. And keep it going. Thank you all for being there.